Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. I'm Jamey Eisenberg. That's Heath Cummings. That's Chris Towers. Before we get into Overreaction Monday, Bears coach Matt Nagy has announced that he has tested positive for COVID-19. We'll find out if he's able to coach for the Bears as they take on the San Francisco 49ers in week number 8. But again, Nagy making the announcement that he has tested positive for COVID-19. We'll have more reaction to that coming up later throughout the day on CBS Sports HQ. One other announcement, Matt Rule, Panthers head coach, says on Monday that Sam Darnold will remain the quarterback for the Panthers in Week 8 as they take on the Falcons. Again, another story that will keep you up to date throughout the day here on HQ. Let's get to our Overreaction Monday now. We'll start with some players who are maybe struggle a little bit. You guys might be panicked about it a little bit. The guys will tell you if you should maybe consider benching them, trying to trade them, maybe trying to trade for them if the value is as low as it could potentially be. We'll start with Aaron Jones, who's coming off a disappointing game for the Packers despite the win against the Washington football team. 6 carries for 19 yards, 5 catches for 20 yards. Heath, it's been a little up and down for him lately as A.J. Dillon has started to come on a little bit. Now, Dillon didn't do very much against Washington, but Aaron Rodgers certainly did. Are we panicked about Aaron Jones to the point where we may consider sitting him for some of these guys that have emerged of late and have some maybe better matchups coming forward?
I can't think of any of those guys right now in a vacuum that I would start over. I think it's possible that one of them, because a matchup, might end up in that situation, but this isn't completely new from Aaron Jones. I believe he had 4 games with 30 or fewer yards in 2019 and finished as a top 5 running back. The Packers do a pretty good job of structuring their game plan around the defense they're facing. They were facing a Washington secondary that's absolutely abysmal, so they threw the ball a bunch. I think Aaron Jones is going to be just fine.
Cordero Patterson or Aaron Jones?
Patterson gets the Panthers this week. Probably going to be Patterson for me.
Leonard Fournette or Aaron Jones?
Probably going to be Jones.
All right, so
yeah.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be interesting to see some of the rank lists for Aaron Jones this week. Also, the same thing for Antonio Gibson because he's been struggling, but he has a dream matchup in Week 8 against the Denver Broncos, who just could not stop Dearness Johnson. But as we saw in Week 7 in that same game against the Packers, 14 for 51, 2 of 5 in the air, and was outsnapped by J.D. McKissic. Now, Chris, we know Gibson's battling the shin injury that left him out of practice for several days last week, so that's something to factor in with what Gibson's dealing with. But where are we at with Antonio Gibson? Are we starting him against the Broncos or potentially sitting him in Week 8?
Yeah, I think you're almost certainly starting Antonio Gibson, but he's definitely not the borderline number 1 running back that we thought he would be coming into the season. And the big problem is that the role change that we were hoping he would see coming into his second season just hasn't materialized. Washington has run 75 pass plays on third down this season. Antonio Gibson has been on the field for 3 of them. That's 4%. They've been involving him in the pass game in non-obvious passing situations, early downs. They'll draw up a screen for him. We saw him break a big play a couple weeks ago. That was nice to see. But what we know about this team by now is that when the situation calls for them to pass, hurry up, keep the passing game on the field, it's going to be a lot of J.D. McKissic. Like you said, he did outsnap Antonio Gibson. That should be less of a problem against Denver. Denver probably isn't going to put up enough points for Washington to have to trail, but I still think Gibson, you're kind of just hoping either he breaks off a big play, which he's pretty good at, or he gets into the end zone. Otherwise, maybe 80 to 100 total yards is probably what you're looking at, even in a good matchup. So lower to mid-range RB2 for me.
All right, maybe a buy low opportunity here, just knowing that this defense he's facing is so bad. You don't have to give up a lot for him, and maybe this is the jumping off point for Antonio Gibson if, in fact, he could stay healthy. But obviously, reason for some concern based on the injury and what we've seen the last couple of weeks. This one, I'm sure, is going to be fun to talk about. When I tweeted some of the names that we're going to talk about for Overreaction Monday, when I said Mike Davis, somebody replied, you should rage drop Mike Davis at this point because he's been so frustrating. Has not topped 10 non-PPR points, 9 non-PPR points all season. It's been a little struggle for him, and he's coming off his worst game to date. 4 carries for 10 yards against the Dolphins, no catches, despite playing 60% of the snaps. So are we at the point now where Mike Davis should not be in your fantasy lineups, even with a good matchup against his former team, the Panthers?
I'm generally really against spike dropping, rage dropping, because you shouldn't let emotions factor into this. You just got to make the best decision for your team. But sometimes you got to get it out of your system, and this is the perfect candidate to get it out of your system. Mike Davis has no place on your roster right now. I'm not even so sure that he'd be the guy if something happened to Cordero Patterson. Wayne Gallman might be playing better than him right now. It's okay if Mike Davis is on the waiver wire. Don't be alarmed. Don't pick him up.
You know how I feel usually about revenge games, and even I can't get behind this one, even though he's taking on the Panthers. He may fall into the end zone. Hopefully that's the case for those of you still stuck with him, but just not a pretty situation right now as Cordarrelle Patterson clearly is the best running back for Atlanta, and like you said, Heath, we might start seeing Wayne Gallman taking on more work. Let's stay with the Falcons, talk about Calvin Ridley, who's been, let's face it, disappointing so far based on what the expectations were. Drafted as a top 5 fantasy receiver. Did not play in week 5 because of personal reasons, so comes back after their bye week in week 7 against the Dolphins. Gets 10 targets, only 4 catches for 26 yards. Now, he was saved by the touchdown, but Chris, this is a guy that's been a little frustrating for fantasy managers. So where are we at moving forward with him?
I mean, it certainly feels a lot like Juju Smith-Schuster that first year without Antonio Brown, where there were some conversations about him being the number 1 overall wide receiver. Same with Calvin Ridley this offseason with Julio Jones leaving. The only difference there is we did have at least some kind of sample size of Calvin Ridley without Julio Jones. Prior to this season, he had played 8 games without Julio Jones in the lineup, and he'd averaged 20.1 PPR points per game. So it's hard to say that this is just Calvin Ridley being exposed without Julio Jones, being exposed as the number 1 wide receiver. I don't have a good explanation for it, though. He's at 5.4 yards per target. That's awful, but he's still right around a 25% target share. That's where he was at yesterday. The average depth of target still over 10 yards per target. So I think maybe we're just seeing some bad variance, and hopefully the emergence of Kyle Pitts as a real outside option. We saw on a couple of plays consecutively yesterday down the stretch. He was lined up outside and had some big plays. Hopefully that'll open things up for Calvin Ridley, make him, able to see a little bit less defensive pressure, and hopefully he'll get going. I can't sell low on him right now, though. The target share is still number 1 wide receiver quality.
Hopefully he starts to deliver. Again, great matchup coming up against Carolina, and let's face it, the Dolphins did have their top cornerbacks back with Xavier Howard and Byron Jones, so not a bad idea for Matt Ryan to look elsewhere. But again, the touchdown did save you. The targets, however, still there. Production, not as much, so hopefully better days ahead for Calvin Ridley. Chris mentioned Julio Jones was with Ridley last year. Now he's in Tennessee and continues to struggle. So is he in the Mike Davis category of a guy you're just going to drop and not have any hesitation about it? No touchdowns so far in the season. 4 targets last week against the Chiefs in a game that they won, 27-3. 2 catches, 38 yards.
I'm not dropping Julio Jones. I think the overreaction might be saying there's no chance that you can play him this week because he's at Indianapolis. I'm not sure that pass defense is going to be very good at all unless there's a rain and a hurricane again. So I'm probably going to treat Julio Jones this week as a low-end number 3 wide receiver who still has big potential against the Colts. I understand why people are frustrated. The snap count certainly 50% in week 3 against the Colts, 43% in this game against the Chiefs. And I do think you might just see that in situations where they're not going to pass. They're not going to have Julio Jones run block. So he's not going to be on the field as much as we would like. But I still think in this matchup with his name, I'm probably going to have him as the number 3 wide receiver.
All right, so for those of you in 3 receiver leagues, you could still consider starting Julio Jones. But this start of the season for him, battling injuries, no touchdowns again. Targets haven't been there, and you're starting to see the best of A.J. Brown. So that's where Ryan Tannehill's probably going to go. So wouldn't be surprised if we see him drop to some 10-team leagues, but 12-team leagues or larger, hard to get away from what Julio Jones still will hopefully become. Maybe the same thing with Brandon Cooks, who's coming off a down game. He's had 3 of his last 4 struggling performances. So against the Cardinals, 5 catches, 21 yards on 7 targets. It's now 5 games in a row without finding the end zone, only 1 touchdown so far in the season. So in non-PPR leagues, Brandon Cooks has been a disappointment. In PPR, the last stretch of games has been a struggle for him. So, Chris, where are we coming out on Brandon Cooks heading into another tough matchup as they take on the Rams in Week 8?
Yeah, it's really tough to trust him against the Rams with Davis Mills as the quarterback. And I think that's ultimately a lot of what it comes down to. I don't think it's fair to say that Davis Mills is the reason the Texans offense has been bad since he took over, but I also don't think he's the kind of player who's going to lift this offense. And, the Texans are trying to build for the future and see what they have. And so I could see why they might want to keep Davis Mills out there. But for the sake of this offense, they've scored 1 or 0 touchdowns in 4 of his 5 starts now, 4 of his 5 starts. And I just don't think this offense can be functional without Tyrod Taylor. So hopefully with his hamstring healing up, he can get back out there and be named the starting quarterback. I would trust Brandon Cooks if Tyrod Taylor was the starter, even against the Rams, as more like a number 2 to number 3 wide receiver.
All right, well, Chris,
if it's Davis Mills,
I'll cut you off right there because Adam Schefter's reporting right now that Tyrod Taylor, who was on IR with a hamstring injury since week 2, will return to practice on Wednesday. And David Culley said he's our starting quarterback, and when he's healthy, he'll be our starting quarterback. So there you go. So Brandon Cooks headed in the right direction. Good buy low opportunity for people that aren't paying attention to that and thinking that Davis Mills might start again. Make some trade offers for Brandon Cooks, and hopefully the best is yet to come because the schedule also gets a little bit lighter once we get past that Rams game. Heath, TJ Hawkinson, we thought maybe turned the corner last week, but comes back with another disappointing performance against the Rams. No surprise, tough matchup there for him. So we're seeing tight ends emerge. You might have picked up Dalton Schultz along the way. Maybe, Hunter Henry, Zach Ertz coming off a strong game. Targets were there, 9 targets against the Rams, but 6 for 48. Not exactly what people were hoping for when they drafted him as a top 5 tight end.
Yeah, it's just he is so completely inefficient. We talked about it a little bit coming into this season. He'd been at 6.2, 7.2 yards per target over his first 2 years in the league, and he was still young enough. There was kind of some hope that would get better this year. 6.8 yards per target. So he has to have 9 targets to put up any type of decent numbers without a touchdown. Now, that being said, he's still a tight end, and there's not that many guys I would move ahead of him. Kyle Pitts I had behind him at the beginning of the year. I'd rather have Kyle Pitts now. You mentioned Dalton Schultz. I'd rather have Dalton Schultz now. I don't think there's anyone else who has emerged that I would take over TJ Hawkinson. He's still a low-end starting tight end.
Dallas Goedert in the same game. Who would you rather have?
I will probably go with TJ Hawkinson.
All right, yeah. I have those. Right now it's Schultz, Goedert, Hawkinson for me back to back. So hopefully Hawkinson bounces back, but a little bit frustrating. But the nice thing is the Eagles don't necessarily have the type of defenders to stop a guy like TJ Hawkinson. Foster Moreau scoring a touchdown against them on Sunday without Darren Waller there as they took on the Raiders.